All right, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone who has joined us today. Um, Quite exciting. We haven't had a LogiSYM webinar in quite a few months. We had quite a few webinars at the height of COVID. We had a webinar every couple of months, and then we kind of stopped it and reverted back to a live engagement model. But Peter is a board member of the Logistics Society, and of course, he probably doesn't need very much introduction. He's also to a lot of us on this call, and we had the opportunity when we were talking last week to organize this update on the ILW situation or the strike situation in all the major ports in Canada and the US. So we jumped on this opportunity. We are great that so many of you took the chance to actually come and listen to the master himself give us an update of what the situation is like. So with all our webinars, Peter will be presenting for the next 20 minutes or so. And during that time, please use the chat function to ask us questions, and I'll try and moderate them towards the end of Peter's presentation. Or you can always ask a live question as well. So I see we've got some industry experts on the line. I see we've got Tom O'Donnell, we've got Brett, we've got Kendrick, we've got Peter Sundara. So if any of you gentlemen or anyone else on this webinar would like to ask a question live of Peter, please do not hesitate to ask. The only request I have is let Peter finish his presentation first, and then we will start with the questions. And you can, at any point in time, type your questions into the chat as well, and we'll try and address as many of them as possible. So with that, Peter, thanks for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you, Ramon. Can you hear me okay? Is
Yes,
my
we
audio?
can.
My audio is coming through okay. Well, thank you so much. It's just a great pleasure to be with you and all of your members and others from the community who have joined us. I've never really done a webinar quite like this, where the subject that we're talking about is really unfolding in real time. So literally in 2 hours from now, it will be midnight U.S. East Coast time, and that is the deadline that the Longshore Labor Union, 45,000 dock workers who are working, unloading containers and loading containers and also automobiles, every port from Maine down to Texas, are going to go on strike unless there's some last minute deal that occurs in the next 2 hours, which is possible. I'm going to say it's somewhat unlikely, and I'll explain why. But we're very much in a real time situation here. These ports account for about 60% of U.S. container traffic. So 6 in 10 containers are moving through these ports, and it's roughly $588 billion of trade. It's about 20% thereabouts of total U.S. imports. If a strike occurred, and especially if a strike lasted for more than just a couple days, this will become just the latest of many supply chain shocks that many of you have had to endure ever since the beginning of COVID, almost exactly 5 years ago, within a month or so. So why don't I just sort of move through this. I'll bring you right into the latest situation. So the union, which is called the International Longshoremen's Association, or the ILA, cut off negotiations with the management group, which is the United States Maritime Alliance. And that is a multi-employer bargaining unit that bargains with the ILA. It exists solely for the purpose of making contracts with this labor union. And they cut off negotiations back in June. And there haven't been any talks since then, up until 24 hours ago, when it became obvious to the White House and to members of Congress and others that a strike was imminent. And so the government has now gotten involved to sort of knock heads together and say, okay, guys, it's time to start talking finally. And so there have been some talks and some offers that have been extended. You can see this email right here, or this announcement from USMX that was released at approximately 6 a.m. this morning, Singapore time, and and there are a couple important things in there. One is that the ocean carriers are now offering a higher wage to the union. Up until now, over the past any number of months, the ocean carriers, and when I say the ocean carriers, they are the members of the board of the United States Maritime Alliance, which we call USMX. So that's why I'm calling the carriers, because it's the MSCs, the Maersks, the Hapag-Lloyds, Costco, these companies that are calling the shots here. And this announcement says something, a couple things that are fairly important. One is that they have come off of their wage increase offer that had been in place for a number of months, which was approximately 32%. So they're offering them a 32% wage increase over the period of a 6-year contract. And the union had been asking for between 75, 77% in that neighborhood. So the management has come up. They're willing to offer the union more, and that is very new. But they also say here, and if you just look at if you go and look at the very last line, they say that they are not budging, retaining the current language on automation and semi-automation. And this is a real sort of what you might call a sticking point with the carriers. The reason is that the United States is the highest cost port system for the ocean carriers in the world. So the cost to load and unload containers is higher in the U.S. than it is anywhere, largely because the wages paid to the dock workers are the highest anywhere. West Coast dock workers, on average, make around $250,000 a year each. The ILA workers make somewhat less than that, but still, it's very, very paying blue collar work. And so the ocean carriers basically, number one, have to pay higher port costs in the U.S. than anywhere else. Number two, the productivity of U.S. ports is very low, and I want to just move on and show you a slide here. So this is from the Container Port Performance Index. So that is a global index of productivity at ports around the world, which is published jointly by the World Bank and by S&P Global. And this is data that was developed out of my team, out of the Journal of Commerce, and now is published on an annual basis and has become a standard for productivity at container ports around the world. And you can see here that the number one port in the world is the number one U.S. port on this list is Charleston, which ranks 53rd. So there are no U.S. ports in the top 50 ports in the world in terms of productivity performance. The very first one is Charleston, and they're, I think, around 10 or something like that in the top 100. The third issue with the ocean carriers is that the U.S. is the only market in the world where the ocean carriers are not able to collect a terminal handling charge. So essentially everywhere else in the world, at origin, at destination, the ocean carriers are assessing and for the most part fully collecting what's called the THC, which many of you on the call know all about. In the U.S., by longstanding tradition, they're not able to collect a THC, and as a result of that, the carriers, one of the things that they've told us time and time again over the past several months of these negotiations is that the only way that they can have any hopes of achieving higher productivity in the U.S. market is to introduce greater levels of automation into the into the U.S. port system. But the problem is that the unions, especially the ILA on the East and the Gulf Coast, are adamantly opposed to automation. And the way, and if we go sort of back to how this is really playing out, what will be the ingredients of a deal that is potentially able to get done here, maybe in the next couple of days. So yes, the union wants a significant wage increase. They've been very out in the open about that. But if they don't get the full wage increase that they want, such as the 75% increase number that I was mentioning earlier, what are going to be the other concessions that they are going to look for from the ocean carriers that are the members of USMX? They're going to look for more restrictions on automation. They do not want any automation at East Coast and Gulf Coast ports. So they will seek to restrict automation. And the fact that the employers are mentioning this right here means that they, and it signals that they are actually under some pressure here, most likely to give in on automation, meaning to say, okay, we agree that there will be no automation at East and Gulf Coast ports. And they do not want to do that because the productivity is already very, very low at these ports. The costs are very high, and the ability for the carriers to recoup those costs because of the lack of a THC is very low. So here we have a situation where, in all probability, a strike will begin in less than 2 hours time, and there still is quite a bit of horse trading that needs to be done. From an operational standpoint, the ports are closed at this point. 2 hours ahead of the strike, maybe there's a few very last containers are being pulled out of the ports. Ships are starting to arrive and they're starting to drop anchor. And because so many containers have been pulled out of so many U.S. ports, you're going to start to have equipment availability become tight. So chassis, for example, this was one of the big problems during COVID when so many containers were sitting on chassis at distribution centers in the vicinity of U.S. ports, that those chassis were not available to be used to handle more containers and to remove more containers out of the ports. That's one of the reasons why the ports completely bottled up, and why, at one point in early 2022, there were over 100 container ships waiting outside of LA Long Beach, which of course is the largest container port gateway, not just in the US, but in all of the Western hemisphere. So we're going to see, in other words, in the next, assuming that the strike goes forward and continues in effect until there's an agreement, we're going to start to see the system shut down. So we're going to start to see container ships being idled. We're going to start to see the containers on those ships being idled. We're going to start to see the chassis being idled, and as a result of that, you're going to begin to see this scenario of capacity being taken out of the system. And of course, every time we have seen disruption in the container supply chain, ever since the beginning of COVID, it has been the removal, the idling of capacity, whether ships, whether containers, whether chassis. The idling of capacity is what takes capacity out of the market and drives freight rates up. So if we were to look at freight rates, one of the things that we've seen, and I can advance here a bit, and then you can see here that basically freight rates in the bellwether Asia to U.S. trades, both East Coast and West Coast, have been in a free fall. So in other words, what has happened is that the early peak season that occurred this year, so in other words, many container cargo owners, shippers, BCOs, call them whatever you want, saw this strike coming a mile away. It was back in November of 2023 when the ILA first mentioned the possibility of a strike. It was snuck into a press release, midway through a press release on a completely unrelated topic. And there it was in black and white saying, hello, there is the possibility for a strike because we, the ILA, will not work beyond the expiration of our contract, which is midnight, September 30th, East Coast time, which is, of course, less than 2 hours from now. They said that, and they said that we are going to prepare for a strike as of that time. Now, just in terms of context, the U.S. West Coast, which is a different union, it's the International Longshore and Warehouse Union, the ILWU. They are most commonly associated with longshore labor disruption at U.S. ports. The reason for that is that every single one of their contract negotiations, going back to the 1990s, has been associated with disruption at the ports, sometimes very, very severe. 2014, 2015, even 2023, there was quite a bit of disruption, but it happened for a completely different reason. Whereas the ILA is saying right now they are not working beyond the end of their contract. The ILWU in every one of those cases was willing to work beyond the end of their contract. They kept working, they kept the ports open, but since there was no grievance procedure, the grievance procedure being when because there's no contract, there's no grievance procedure, therefore the employers can't call an arbitrator in and say, hey, what you're doing is wrong, it violates the contract. Because none of that machinery is in place, it means that the ILWU has been free to engage in disruptive activities, and that's why they extend over many, many months. So there were 6 months of very severe disruption in 2014 and 2015, for example. So just to go back here, one of the things when I mentioned that importers have been very aware of the possibility of a strike, this chart shows that. It shows that the growth this year into the U.S. West Coast has been much greater than the growth to the East Coast. So there was already diversion activities occurring. There's a chart here related to railroads. So the number of rail cars that are activated in the U.S. to handle containers, in other words, the type of rail cars that you put a container in, those have gone up significantly. That is the result of a lot of that diversion occurring to the West Coast, where rail cars are being activated, and also they're being transferred from the East Coast railroads to the West Coast railroads. So you can really see in the data the impact of the anticipation of a strike, and now to the extent that this strike happens, even to begin with, and to the extent that it lasts even more than just a few days, we're going to start to see market impact as a result of that. So what is the union's logic? What has sort of got us to this point? Well, from the union's point of view, this is like a once in a lifetime opportunity. And you can really see what their strategy is. Okay. The ocean carriers made an enormous sum of money during the pandemic. All those 20,000, 25,000 FEU freight rates that so many shippers had to pay, went right into the pockets of the ocean carriers. They made in the neighborhood of about $400 billion in profits. That was calculated by John McCown. He's an independent analyst in the U.S. He's also a protege of Malcolm McLean, by the way, this guy. So he estimated $400 billion in profits from 2020 through 2023. Alan Murphy at Sea Intelligence, who is also based here in Singapore, he has estimated that $400 billion that the carriers earned during those 4 years was more than the total profits that the container shipping industry had earned from the very first ship sailed by Malcolm McLean in 1957 all the way through 2020 in COVID. That's how much money the ocean carriers made during this time. And the ILA is looking at that and they're saying, look, this is our big opportunity to try to get a piece of that for our members. And so what did they do? They know that September 30th, very conveniently timed in terms of executing a strategy like that, essentially said, okay, this is right in the middle of a presidential election. The Democrats are going to be relying on union vote in their favor in order to elect the Democratic candidate, Vice President Kamala Harris. they know that the one way that the Biden administration and Kamala Harris will piss off the labor union members all across the country, irrespective of what industry they're in, hotels, construction, railroads, airlines, you name it. The one way that they can really alienate those voters is by invoking what's called the Taft-Hartley Act, which is a power that the president has to force striking workers back on the job. You can invoke that law. It was invoked by President George W. Bush in 2002 to reopen the LA Long Beach port complex, which had been closed for 10 days, due to a labor dispute at that time. But the Taft-Hartley Act is considered by labor unions to be an anti-labor law. It is cutting the union out from, it's cutting them off at the knees. It's telling them, look, you got to go back to work. Your big leverage, the big leverage of unions is going out on strike. That's how they force management to the table. But no, I'm going to force you back to work. Therefore, they can't do that. And politically, they can't do it. And this is Harold Daggett in this picture. He's the president of the ILA, and he knew that Biden could not invoke Taft-Hartley. And indeed, Biden said in a video, it's out there on social media. He made it very clear the other day that he said, quote, I don't believe in Taft-Hartley. And so he's not going to force him back to work. So Daggett knew that, and he knew that that plays into his hand. He also knew that, oh, wait a second, I'm not going to necessarily endorse Biden. I'm going to go have a chat with my friend Donald Trump, this is a few months ago, where he went down to Mar-a-Lago and then posted this picture to let everybody know that that he's not going to get pushed around in these negotiations. Ramon, how am I doing time-wise? Because I don't want to run over time, and I want to make sure that we have enough time for Q&A.
I think you're doing fine, Peter. If you wrap up in a couple of minutes, we've got a few questions. So we should be good. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. So, here we are, where the only thing that the government can really do is just try to knock heads together, is try to go to the ocean carriers and say, come on, guys, you earned a princely sum during COVID, give them a little more. We really need to get the port. We really need to avoid a strike, or we need to get the ports reopened. They're going to the union. They're saying, come on, guys, let's go. Because we do not want a disruption. And the Biden-Harris administration is kind of in a little bit of a conundrum here, because they can't invoke Taft-Hartley and piss off the unions just ahead of a presidential election. But they also know that if this strike drags on for a while, then it's going to start impacting the economy. And the economy happens to be a weak spot for the Kamala Harris ticket, where Trump consistently polls higher in terms of his ability to manage the economy versus the Democrats. And so it is a Achilles heel if, for example, the strike drags on and goods are not able to get to stores, inflation might perk up, that kind of thing, which of course the Republicans will have a field day with. So therefore, they're going to try this sort of backroom diplomacy, mediation, unofficial mediation, to get these two sides together. And that's, right here, this is the first sort of result of that. The administration even released a statement within the last day or two saying that they are engaging with both sides. They're trying to get them to the table. They're trying to get talks restarted, that kind of thing. And it's really going to come down to what kind of a deal is going to be acceptable. Because again, from the ILA standpoint, they are in the driver's seat. They can keep the ports closed for a while. They don't have to make the deal that they don't want to make, and they are going to be more than happy. Having threatened a strike over several months, it is not the consequences of a strike, and the possibility that they will get blamed for a strike is not entering their mind at all. So, Ramon, why don't I stop there? I know I jumped around quite a bit here, and I'm more than happy to share these slides with anybody who's on the call if you wanna be able to look through them. But anyway, that's where we are, and my colleagues and I at the Journal of Commerce, we've been covering this story very extensively over any number of months. Longshore labor happens to be a sort of a specialty of mine. I write a lot on this subject, and so and also when the dust settles here, and hopefully by by TPM next year, early March in Long Beach. When the dust settles, we will put on a panel on this subject. We'll have some very knowledgeable voices come and talk about what the meaning of all this is going forward. What is the impact on supply chains? How should BCO companies be thinking about this type of activity? What does it mean for supply chain risk? How do they need to think about supply chains going forward? So I will leave it there, Ramon, and I will stop sharing, and then we can take questions and have a conversation. How's that sound?
Yep, fantastic. Thanks, Peter.
Good.
Great data and great information as well. A lot of people have opinions, but I like the fact that you're able to support it with data that the JOC and you guys have been working on. So we've got quite a few questions, and before I go through them, do we have any of the participants who would like to ask a question live? No? All right. Well, whilst you were presenting, Peter, we had a few questions come in. I'll start off with the first one. Oh, I have a hand raised. From the admin. Does admin want to say something?
Yeah, actually, it's Stephanie who accidentally logged in as admin.
Okay.
Hi, Stephanie. How are you?
Hi, Peter. I'm well. How are you?
Very well, thank you.
Good, good. I just had a question. What is the potential that this is actually going to risk accelerating that automation implementation in order for ports to actually de-risk their operations? I mean, a lot of organizations turn to automation as a way to address issues with labor. Is this opening the door to that?
Well, not in the U.S. It isn't.
Okay.
It's actually the risk is that automation goes backwards. These are incredibly strong unions. These are some of the strongest unions in the world in terms of the leverage that they have, and they have been able to really put the brakes on automation. So you have nothing in the U.S. The likes of the ICTSI terminal, for example, in Melbourne, Australia, which is a fully automated terminal.
Yeah.
You have some automation at a few U.S. West Coast terminals at the Port of Los Angeles and the Port of Long Beach. But I don't think that it's going to open the door to further automation on the East Coast and the Gulf Coast. It's too difficult to get that through and get the union to buy in on that. They're like ideologically opposed to it.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Interesting. So we're saying that they have such a strong stranglehold on the ports. The ILWU, or the ILA rather, has such a strong stranglehold on the ports that they can actually push us backwards and not forwards in terms of automation and digitalization.
I think so. This has been a longstanding grievance within the international trade community in the U.S., where the U.S. is not competitive on port performance, and port performance is an element of trade facilitation, and a key element of it. And we see time and again when U.S. ports get inundated with just a little bit too much cargo, that their ability to process those goods and keep the ports fluid can break down fairly quickly.
Okay. So thanks, Peter. We have a question from Tom, and his statement was, the Maersk CEO made a comment the other day that for every day the port goes on strike, it would take 6 days to recover. I think you mentioned 5 days when you were speaking just now. So what's JOC's opinion on this?
Well, no question that the longer the strike goes, the time that it takes. So like a work stoppage of 3 days might take a week or 2 weeks for the whole system to restart. A week long strike will take 4 weeks. A 2 week strike will take 8 weeks to possibly even longer. So the impact accelerates, and it becomes magnified the longer the system is idle.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So next question, thanks. So what do you think the impact will be on overall supply chains, especially when you consider that Montreal is also on strike or is thinking of going on strike? I think they are on strike. So what do you think the effect's going to be? I think that's an easy answer.
Well, it's yet another shock to the system if it lasts. I mean, now we've become all too used to these extreme shocks, which is relatively new historically speaking. I mean, prior to COVID, companies had been very accustomed to at least international containerized supply chains that for the most part function fairly efficiently. Costs were low, schedule reliability was fairly high and consistent, and companies did not have to really worry about supply chains. It was
Mm-hmm.
not a subject that came up in conversation very often. So now, as a result of COVID, as a result of the Red Sea, as a result of this, which is at the very least a big scare, even if it doesn't actually occur, it forces companies to acknowledge the fact that the whole supply chain environment is not what they want it to be. They liked it the way it was, and but it's like another reminder that we do not seem to be going back to those days.
Mm-hmm. And I think one big downside of all these shocks to the system, as you call it, is we all of a sudden have all these supply chain experts crawling out of the woodwork, giving us their opinions about how things should be, when they have no clue about what actually makes the industry tick. By the way, that's my
I'm one of those people, Raymond, because all I am is a journalist, and so literally everything I'm saying is what I've been told by other people. Like, I'll tell you how many containers I've moved in my lifetime. One FEU, one time.
from
That in
New
one
York to
direction. That
Singapore.
was my house, my couches and my TV and everything when it moved from New York to Singapore last year.
Right.
Hardly what you would call extensive experience in this industry.
But it was not a stab at you. It's just that I'm sure that a lot of us work with people, consultants, people within our organizations that crawl out of the woodwork and all of a sudden have an opinion about, well, this is what you should be doing in logistics. Anyway, moving on. So we have a question from Stevie, and his question is, do you think this will spill over into South American ports as well?
So if this goes on for a little while, it will start to have global reverberations. So one of the topics that we're going to explore at TPM in March is this idea of a globalization of the impact, if you will. So in prior days, in older days, individual trade lanes kind of operated based on their own individual supply and demand dynamics, and they were fairly isolated from one another, compared to today, when, say, the Red Sea impact affected freight rates globally. drove freight rates up globally, even on trade lanes that were physically unaffected by the Red Sea diversions. And so, if you have a lengthy strike, you're going to have sort of waves of impact emanating outwards from this, and it will depending on how long it lasts. And again, it may not last very long at all. It may get solved very quickly, in which case this all evaporates instantaneously. But if it lasts for 2 weeks or something, you get into that type of a situation. Yeah, it's going to be felt globally, including in South America.
So, Peter, we were chatting on WhatsApp yesterday, and I said, shall we make a bet whether the strike happens or not? And we see this with the ILWU almost every year. We see this during budget time in the US. It's the brinkmanship. You bring this whole situation, you make a lot of threats, empty promises, and then at the last minute, you force someone to make a deal. Are we going to see that here? What's your opinion?
Well, I mean, we have seen that announcement that I showed you earlier. That was more movement in these negotiations than has occurred since June. Since June, nothing happened. The union cut off negotiations, and the ocean carriers acting through USMX literally asked the union 11 times to come back to the table, and then they finally went to the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board, to try to force the union back to the table, saying that they were bargaining in bad faith by not coming to the table at all. And so this announcement is more movement than we've seen in this particular scenario in quite a long time. Now, does that mean that we are now charging at full speed towards a deal? It means that the logjam is breaking and the sides are talking. And so that is precisely what has not happened over any number of months. And so, does that lead to a deal, or are they going to get into areas where companies like the ocean carriers have said that they will not agree to, like the automation issue that was mentioned in that announcement.
So, if all hell breaks loose, or not all hell breaks loose, but if the strikes do occur, when do you think we'll start seeing that cargo start to back up in West Coast ports? By 1 week, 2 weeks? When do you think those repercussions will be felt, say in Singapore, for example?
It will take a few weeks for that to happen. I mean, a lot of that one chart I showed you showed how volumes through the West Coast this year have been much higher. Growth has been much higher than the East Coast this year. So there has already been a lot of diversions that have already occurred. For companies that are trying to avoid the East Coast, the time to do that was 2 months ago. It was, or at most 6 weeks ago, something like that. Now it's too late. Jeremy Nixon at ONE was at a conference here in Singapore the other day. He said that their ships are going to anchor, they're going to be idled, and they're going to be filled with cargo. And all of that cargo is going to get idled. There is really no opportunity at this point in order to avoid. If you're headed to the East Coast now, it's too late. You should have been thinking about this, many weeks ago, a couple months ago, that kind of thing, Raymond.
Okay. Thanks, Peter. So do you think the ILWU, this is a question from Monica, can legally show sympathy to the ILA through work slowdowns or even a strike? Do you think they're going to join the
It's illegal for them to do that. It would fall within the realm of what's called an illegal secondary boycott, which you can't do. It is very difficult. If, say, for example, you were a BCO and you said, I don't want to have our cargo be anywhere near the East Coast as we get towards September 30th. So I'm going to divert. I'm going to talk to my ocean carrier and my freight forwarder, and I'm going to say, look, I need to get these goods through the West Coast to avoid any potential problem. The ILWU on the West Coast does not know if a container they are unloading has been diverted, but they will know if a ship gets diverted. And they are now asked to unload vessels that normally would be calling at East Coast ports. They would be watching that very closely, and that is where there would be a very high probability of what you might call sympathy actions. But because of that possibility, I don't think it would happen.
Thanks. So I think you touched on this a bit as well. When should ports in Asia start worrying? I think your answer was we should have started worrying 6 weeks or 8 weeks ago. But maybe you want to add to that.
Yeah, I mean the big pressure on Asia ports already occurred this year. So the traditional peak season, which is usually July, August, and September, was moved up by 2 months. It started in May and June this year, and when you combine that with the fact that transshipment ports that usually handle a lot of transshipments in the Middle East region were not a viable location for transshipments because of the Red Sea diversions, that pushed a lot of volume back onto places like Singapore, which and Singapore wasn't the only one. Port Kelang experienced it, Colombo experienced it, where you had this heavy amount of this sort of unusually large amount of cargo at what is normally a fairly seasonally light time of year. That hit really hard. But whether that is going to be repeated because of this situation, I think that you would need a fairly lengthy disruption on the East Coast for the reverberations really to be felt all the way here in Asia in terms of things like port congestion.
All right. Thanks, Peter. We have a question from Tammy. He's got the hand up. Tammy, what's your question?
I'm a she. Hi, Peter.
Hi, Tammy. How are you?
Hi, I'm good. How are you?
Very well, thank you.
My question is actually from my counterpart, Rolina, mostly. So, when you have a vessel that is supposed to call the East Coast, but then they decide to route themselves to the West Coast. Right now, we're hearing that those people will not work the vessel in conjunction with their brothers and sisters on the East Coast. Are you hearing anything like that?
So I'm not hearing it specifically, Tammy, but it's just what I said a moment ago. It's one thing for individual containers to be diverted because the West Coast Union does not know when they unload a container if it's been diverted from the East Coast to the West Coast. They don't know that. I mean, during 2022 and 2023, you saw a wave of cargo get diverted away from the West Coast to avoid the ILWU negotiations, and there was never any problem with any of that cargo being handled on the East Coast or the Gulf Coast. But if they send a ship, divert a vessel, that is a completely different situation. And that's why I don't think the ocean carriers would do it, because I think they know exactly what would happen. The ship wouldn't get worked, and there would be a whole sort of kerfuffle around it, and that's a scenario that they probably would want to avoid.
Okay. All right.
All right. Thanks, Tammy, for your question.
Curious. And thank you, Peter.
Yeah, nice to hear your voice, Tammy.
And
good to hear your voice.
We have a question from Rolina as well. Rolina, your question, please.
Yeah, so just to tag off of the question that Tammy helped raise. So I had heard, well, we're coming up also on Golden Week. So there's going to be some additional vessels added into what comes into the West Coast. And so I had poked around and asked, different steamship line carriers. And so that's why, as long as the original manifest has West Coast ports as the port of discharge, they'll be worked. And you're right, the ILW doesn't know any different. But I guess my concern now is because I kind of do the same thing as you, Peter. I talk to my customer base and I have lots of followers on LinkedIn, and I ask them, what do they think is going to happen? And I hear anywhere from 2 to 3 days to possibly 2 weeks. But now after hearing and learning, and thank you so much for presenting today, but I learned a lot of differences between the ILWU and the ILA and how the contract negotiations work. I'm starting to get a little bit more worried that this might drag on longer than what we were hoping. Even 2 weeks sounds like that might be a shorter stint.
Thanks,
What are
Rolina.
your
What do you
thoughts?
think, Peter?
Yeah, so it's entirely possible. I mean, like we're saying, Rolina. I mean, the log jam is breaking in terms of conversations occurring. So that is a big change from since June, where there's been no talks occurring. So now at least they're talking, and if they're talking, then the odds that they find an agreement are higher. But we don't know how hard and fast. We know that the employers are willing to up their wage offer. They went from 32% up to 50% pay increase. They said that in that announcement. So that is you could say that's a fairly significant concession. Is that good enough for the ILA? Is the ILA going to say, listen, you have to accept further restrictions on automation? And the ocean carriers, to be honest with you, there's been a real change here in at least the ocean carriers' rhetoric as expressed privately to people like us when we're talking to them. Whereas over many years and all those ILWU negotiations on the West Coast, the ocean carriers' priority was keep the ports open, give the union what they want, not necessarily everything in all cases, but engage in significant concessions to the union. And that's the reason why the ILWU members make so much. But it's also why the ports were for the most part kept open through different bouts of disruption that occurred during those negotiations. But the ocean carriers seem to be really less willing this time around to do that, and so they are they're pretty adamant about the productivity situation, which they're not happy about. Won't necessarily want to give up on automation on the East Coast. That could be a setback. The other issue out there on the East Coast is, does the union want there to be stronger language in the contract that allows them to organize the state employee dock workers at Savannah, Charleston, and Wilmington? Which would, if you ask the folks at Savannah, they would say that they don't want, they want to directly employ their crane drivers, and they want to directly employ their yard workers, and they believe that hybrid model is what has enabled Savannah to maintain high productivity and become the port that Savannah has become over the last quarter of a century. But this could be an issue that comes up in the negotiations, especially as a face-saving measure if, for example, the union was to do things like agree to a lower pay increase than the 70-something% plus that they were asking before. So, we don't know how hard and fast these positions are on both sides, and therefore it is possible that if a strike occurs in the next hour and 10 minutes, that we don't know how long it's going to last.
So, Peter, do you see like a larger play here that this strike also indirectly helps the ocean carriers increase their margins? Because there's always been that sense that there's this fair amount of opportunism by carriers, maybe even by 3PLs and by airlines whenever there's a disruption. So, what's your opinion there?
So the answer is that we now know, ocean carriers now know, that disruption works in their favor. So all those years when they paid the West Coast dock workers whatever they wanted to keep the ports open, that you could look back on that and they say, actually, it's when cargo comes to a halt, that's when they start to make real money. And so they got lucky from a financial point of view with the attacks on shipping by the Houthi rebels. The ocean carriers were looking at 2024 as a very rough year for them. A lot of new capacity coming into the market, very significant pressure on rates. They got a reprieve by that because 10% or thereabouts of container shipping capacity got taken out of the market. If this strike goes on for a while, if it happens and then it goes on for a while, then the same thing's going to happen. The rates are going to go up. They already, a number of the carriers already came out with very, very steep congestion disruption surcharges, $3,000 per container. I don't think I'd ever seen a surcharge like that come anywhere close to that in terms of the amount that they want shippers to pay. So on one hand, yes, disruption favors carrier financials, but then you start talking about to the people on the ground, the heads of the container lines in the U.S., for example. They're like, oh my God, if there's a strike, the impact on their own staffs, their own companies, working their way through all of this disruption is extreme. And there is a side to, for all the complaining that shippers do about ocean carriers. And, a lot of it is, very legitimate, poor customer service and, taking advantage of different situations, whatever. The ocean carriers are actually, at least at the regional level, want to keep serving their customers. They did not want a strike to occur. They did not want to see disruption. That's the reason why they reached out to the union 11 times ever since June to say, look, come back to the table. Let us talk with you. Let's get a deal. Obviously, that has not happened.
Right. Thanks,
yet.
Peter. Yeah. So let's be optimistic here. So what's your advice now to BCOs? We've got a lot of BCOs on this call, both in Singapore, I think some calling in from the US as well. What should the Joe average BCO do? What's your advice to us?
Well, I think that if you still have goods that are coming into the East Coast and those numbers are dropping because a lot of the holiday season goods were already brought in, there's nothing you can do. I think that it's a matter of watching and waiting to see how long this lasts and what the broader impact will be. And I think that that's really all you can do at this point. And then in a broader sense, I mean, it's a matter of having dialogue with senior management, because senior management at BCO companies, in my experience, at least from what I've seen, the first opportunity to not engage in the issue of supply chain disruption and to move on to other things. And to say, look, this is no longer a problem. We're not gonna deal with it. We want to move on. We need supply chains to be smooth running, and we don't have time for this. The thing to do is to use this as an opportunity to educate senior management about the fact that these shocks to the system are coming one after another, and actually we live in a much more disruptive, not just supply chain environment, but global environment, so that senior management is supporting the supply chain teams to work their way through issues, to get out ahead of issues that you may see coming down the pike in the future. Like, it could be sort of a so-called teachable moment.
Mm-hmm. It's something that we can discuss at TPM 25 as well.
Absolutely.
Because, it'll be interesting to look back in a few months, reflect on, we had this webinar in October. This is what we thought the situation was and how right or wrong were we and what the repercussions were. And also talking about how maybe we can avoid this again. There's a last message here, Peter. Someone refers to you as the Walter Cronkite of our industry, with your balanced insights and steady coverage. So with that, Peter, I wanted to thank you very much for taking the time out today. I think based on the audience reaction and the participation we've had, very timely, very appropriate, and excellent comments from you. For those of you who would like a copy of Peter's presentation, we normally send out a survey form at the end of our sessions. When you respond to that survey, you'll get a copy of the presentation. And also just to let everyone know, we are the Logistics Society planning a delegation to attend TPM 25. And that's being coordinated by Kendrick and Peter Sundara. But if you would like to participate in that delegation out of Singapore, please drop one of us an email or a message. Kendrick, can you put your email in the chat so that they can reach out to you?
Okay, sure.
Okay, and with that, thank you again, Peter, for your participation in the audience as well. Excellent, informative session, and fingers crossed, and let's keep on shipping. Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.